The wind howled through the desolate canyons, whipping up dust devils that swirled menacingly across the cracked and desiccated earth. It had been over a year since the fiery cataclysm that rendered most of the world uninhabitable. Carly pulled her tattered scarf tighter across her face as Xander and I trudged along beside her, the three of us keeping a watchful eye on Bucky, our faithful mutt, who sniffed cautiously at the alien landscape. "Think there's anything out here still alive?" Xander's voice was muffled beneath his makeshift mask. I shrugged, not wanting to voice the concern that any creatures surviving this far out would likely be as twisted and mutated as the very terrain itself. We'd stumbled across the remains of things I couldn't even describe a few miles back. Best not to dwell on that if we wanted to keep our sanity intact. After the bombs dropped and the radiation seeped into every nook and cranny, only the most heavily fortified bunkers provided any real shelter. Our parents hadn't made it out in time. Grim thoughts. But we'd all learned to push them aside over the last few years, existing in a sort of numbness purely focused on survival. Carly stopped short up ahead, raising a hand to signal us. I strained my eyes but couldn't make out what had caught her attention at first. Then I saw it, a subtle shimmering in the air, like a heat haze despite the chill breezes whipping past. But it was localized, maybe 4 feet across, shimmering and wavering in a sphere a few hundred yards ahead of us. Bucky started growling lowly, hackles raised. The three of us crouched low, maintaining tense silence. Whatever that distortion was, it felt wrong, unnatural, even in this unnatural world. The shimmering grew more pronounced, darkening to an inky blackness that seemed to perceptibly bend the very light and space around it. My heart was pounding in my ears. Something primal in me wanted to run, to flee from whatever this phenomenon threatened to unleash. The blackness pulsed outward for a moment, like a sudden exhalation. A weird, stringy tendril almost emerged briefly from the central vortex before retracting quickly. The eddies of distorted air howled alarmingly loud now, to the point where we all clapped hands over our ears against the piercing, anguished wails. Carly's eyes were wide with shock and fear, darting between Xander and me, questioning what the hell this thing could possibly be. I had no answers. The vortex collapsed in on itself with a sudden implosion, the shockwave pummeling us and kicking up choking debris. Bucky yelped and scrambled away. As the dust cleared, a figure stood in the anomaly's place. It was vaguely humanoid, too slender and elongated to be a normal person. Instead of any solid form, its entire body seemed sludgy, composed of those same stringy, tendril-like strands solidified into a rough, bipedal shape. Vaguely luminescent, the figure pulsed faintly, strands quivering with some sort of sickening faux life. We stayed absolutely motionless and silent, none of us daring to breathe. This entity wasn't like any mutated creature we'd encountered before. It felt fundamentally, cosmically wrong in a way that pierced straight through to the primitive core of my brainstem, screaming at me that this thing should not exist on any plane we understood. The figure began oozing forward, tendrils stretching out and retracting obscenely. I fought panic, squeezing Carly's hand for dear life while frantically considering any options for escape or defense. That's when it spoke. Not with any sort of mouth or vocal cords. The sound came from everywhere and nowhere all at once, a guttural grinding reverberation that felt like it bypassed our ears entirely to burrow straight into our minds. The dimensional fabric phrase. The voice wasn't one singular entity so much as a clamorous cacophony, like 100 delirious souls all raving madly in unison. My head swam, the words ricocheting around my skull and carving out searing grooves with every repetition. The pathways between realms rupturing, realities bleeding into one another. It took a lurching step closer, appendages oozing grotesquely with every subtle movement. We shrank back, frozen with primal terror. Bucky remained hunkered a few yards away, whining lowly in abject fear. This plane's integrity falters. The thing's reverberating chorus grew louder, angrier. Soon all boundaries shall shatter and chaos shall subsume all Rhea. Soon all boundaries shall shatter and chaos shall subsume all reality. The entity's undulating form seemed to swell and distort with rage at its own proclamation. We cowered helplessly as razors of pure terror sliced into the deepest recesses of our minds. With a sudden burst of movement, it began rapidly closing the distance between us, appendages whipping frenziedly. Fight or flight response kicked in, and we scrambled to our feet, turning to flee in blind panic. A deafening bellow of fury erupted from the creature as we ran. I risked a glance over my shoulder to see those gnashing tendrils extending out in long, sinewy ropes, lashing towards us with blistering speed. One snapped out and coiled around Xander's ankle with horrific strength, lifting him fully off the ground and slamming him brutally into the unyielding earth. Carly and I skidded to a halt, watching in abject horror as more tendrils snared him completely, writhing and constricting like a knot of massive nightmarish worms. His anguished screams pierced the eerie silence as we stood petrified, trembling violently. Bucky was barking madly, fur standing on end as he ineffectually charged towards the melee, only to be backhanded away by a flailing tendril, letting out a sickening yelp. I scooped up a jagged rock without thinking and flung it with every ounce of strength towards the abomination, striking one liquidous pseudopod with a meaty thwack. It briefly recoiled, those chorus howls of rage echoing out once more. That split second was all I needed. "Run!" I screamed at Carly, scooping up Bucky in my arms, tears streaming down my face as I turned from Xander's mutilated remains, his gurgling shrieks abruptly choked off. We fled across that scorched hellscape, the eldritch shrieks and sounds of pursuit following in our wake until slowly, mercifully, fading into the desolate wasteland behind us. Whatever that entity was, some horror birthed from the very fabric of our mangled reality itself. We could only run. Run until we could run no further from the waking nightmare that the world had become.